Welcome to today's webinar. I'm Ashley Murphy, the founder and principal of Arete Wealth Strategists Australia. Today's webinar is Bridging Retirement, bringing your US retirement accounts back home to Australia and how to do so in a tax efficient and compliant manner. Please note my general advice disclosures here. Today's presentation does not constitute personal financial tax or investment advice. It has not been prepared taking into consideration your financial objectives or needs, and you should therefore consider the appropriateness of this advice in light of your own objectives. Okay, so just as a matter of course, before these presentations, sometimes people email me individually and they say, hey, here's my circumstance. Can you just address this? The answer is no, unless I am your financial advisor. It's not me being mean-hearted or spirited, by the way. It is literally, the law is very clear in that I cannot provide advice to someone whose broader fact pattern I don't know, who is thus not a client. I should mention our YouTube channel. Every month I do these presentations. I've been doing them now for about 5 years, so there's many dozens of presentations available on our YouTube channel. You can also find them at our website, Arete -wa.com. That's the Arete Wealth Strategists Australia website. And if you're interested in this topic, please feel free to subscribe to the YouTube channel. Next month's topic I'll be presenting, or I'll be highlighting at the end of today's presentation. A little bit about me and how I came to be doing what I do. Really, you could say I was born into it. Tri-citizen, US, UK, and Australia. Lived in the US for 20 years, did my undergraduate education here in Queensland, at the University of Queensland. Moved to the US in 2005, worked in corporate finance, and I've been a financial advisor really since 2010. I founded the Global Financial Planning Institute with Matt Gorin, who is actually the head of curriculum for one of the largest certified financial planning providers, course prep providers in the US. So he and I run the GFP Institute, where we train other international and cross-border advisors on what they need to know when working with clients whose financial lives cross borders. I'm a regular conference speaker and have organized a partnership with the Investments of Wealth Institute and the GFP Institute. Arete Wealth Strategists, a little bit about us. We have about 100 clients, manage a little over 130 million US dollars in assets under management, and work with clients with a minimum of $1 million US dollars in investable assets to help solve these kinds of problems. Broadly speaking, here's 3 profiles of the kinds of clients that we work with. You got your business owner living between Australia and the US. You got your high net worth family currently living in the US, but maybe they'll move back to Australia, concerned about how their exposure to the exit tax might look. And then there's the family that's permanently relocated to the US and has had to tie up all sorts of loose ends on the Australian side. Okay, so with that out of the way, let's get on to today's presentation. This is probably the 4th or 5th iteration of this topic that I've done. And I'd like you to know I review the content every time, and I'm making slight tweaks and improvements as I go. So I think this is going to be the best yet, and I hope you'll agree by the end of the presentation. So first, I start off just setting the context of what today's presentation is about. That is, one has returned from the United States. They have retirement accounts in the US. They're looking to get them back to Australia. Next, we'll look into the foreign exchange environment. When is a good time to move one's funds? How does the rate compare currently? What's the most cost-effective way to move funds? That's a whole nother topic, talking about foreign exchange, but it's also very simple as well for those that understand how foreign exchange providers make their money, and that is through what's called the interbank rate spread. What types of accounts are eligible for today? Or are we really talking about in today's presentation? Because there are many types that aren't relevant, like inherited IRAs. Inherited IRAs, we will do a webinar just on that topic. So the rules have changed. It's become incredibly complicated since Secure Act 2.0 came into effect in 2023. There's now all sorts of varying situations, but the most common one we see is a 10-year distribution window that someone has to distribute an inherited IRA. Next, I have to talk about residency definitions. As dull as that sounds, it really is the fork in the road because it's going to determine what set of options are available to you to distribute this account. So that's when I'll go and talk about options for temporary or former US tax residents, and then options for US tax residents. And then lastly, conclude with what to do with your money when back in Australia. I should also mention that the presentation is being recorded. If you have registered, you will be notified, as we do every month, of course. I love for these presentations to be interactive. So if you have questions, it's kind of my reward, if you will, for attending this live, then I'm happy to answer your question as we go. But if you've got a more detailed question, please save that for the end. Of course, remember, this is not specific advice. This is general advice, and this is just a matter of providing a public service, but also getting our firm's name and reputation out there as a provider in this space. Okay, so moving your retirement funds from the US, what are the 5 things that come up when I think of this topic? First, the eligible types of accounts. When is a good time? Converting your money most cost effectively, residency definitions, and then something I didn't mention but should have in the introduction there is tax and investment considerations as a US tax resident abroad. That is incredibly important because a topic that comes up every single time I have a fit meeting with a prospective client is, what is your intention with your US either legal permanent resident status or citizenship status now that you're settled back in Australia? And I am under I have no incentive to recommend that someone take one action or the other. It's my job to simply say, here are the pros and cons of either decision. And we'll talk about those pros and cons when we get to that. Someone's written into the chat. Thank you. Do I have to make an Otter account to see it? I don't know what that's about, but apparently Sarah has her Otter transcription going there. And I've yet to formalize a policy on that, Sarah. Looking forward to speaking with you in the not too distant future, but there may be a change of policy on AI bots listening in and transcribing what I say here. Okay, so the situation description for folks here on today's webinar would be, you've moved from the US, you've got funds in the US in some kind of retirement account, probably a 401k, 403b, an IRA, possibly also, note the stars around the possibly also 457 deferred comp account. I feel very confident about the 401k, 403b, IRA. The 457, that's actually recently come up with a client. It's a fascinating situation. He's worked at a company, he's knocked the ball out of the park with his annual performance, and he's opted to put away a large amount of money, millions of dollars, into a deferred compensation account. And a deferred compensation account, what makes these accounts particularly interesting is you're not taxed presently, you're taxed when that amount is paid out. And so for every US citizen, which of course is 99.9% of people that would be subject to a 457 deferred comp account, they're simply taxed in the exact same way as any other retirement account. They're taxed as ordinary income as that amount is paid out. However, might there be a better treatment available? And I am optimistic, although not certain, hence the little stars around the possibly also. I'm optimistic that we could get Australian-US income tax treaty treatment to apply to the 457 deferred comp account, which would be a phenomenal tax outcome for that client. But let me not get distracted on that point. Also includes Roth IRAs, Roth 401ks, and for whom today's webinar does not apply to, this would be inherited IRAs. Why? Inherited IRAs, health savings accounts, or 529s, simply because when we get to the language of, which is very boring, but Article 18.1 of the US Australian Double Income Tax Treaty, it says that accounts that have been accrued by way of work for the purpose of retirement, and inherited IRAs, well, that was someone else's retirement, not yours. So that's why that does not apply. Health savings, clearly it's not related to retirement, and same with college savings account. It is present in the title. Christine, no worries. I think you were meaning, I was just addressing your chat here. I think you were probably meaning to chat to Sarah there. So got it. Oh, that's a tricky one. 401As. Now that's a rare animal, typically seen in the university sector. I would be inclined to say yes, with a high likelihood that 401As are also covered, Scott. So that's a great question. I didn't include it there, but very likely, and simply because they're personal retirement accounts. Same with pension accounts as well, defined benefit cash balance type pension accounts as well. Okay, when is a good time to move your funds? Now, there's really two thoughts that come to mind when I ask that question, a second one of which we'll get to later on, and that's to do with, are you older than 59 and a half? Because that's going to be a very important date if you are a US tax resident. But let's say you have unfettered access to these retirement funds. Really, the question then becomes, what's my tax treatment going to be this year? What other income do I have that's going to be adding to my taxable income? And also, how's the exchange rate doing? And just a moment ago when I took the screenshot yesterday, but a moment ago when I looked at the exchange rate, we see that it has rocketed up, getting very close now to 67 cents, the highest it's been in almost a year. We can certainly see a trend line from the beginning of the year when the Trump administration took office, and we see a gradual weakening of the US dollar. I think we're going to continue to see that weakening over time. I don't have a target exchange rate in mind, but I would suggest that's going to continue to weaken, maybe with some short-term volatility with the expected rate cut announcements. It's not a sure thing, of course, but it's very likely with the pressure on the Fed and maybe with some softening data on the US side that we'll see a rate cut, maybe 2 or even 3 throughout the remainder of this year. When they come through, and assuming Australia doesn't do the same, which is a big and important assumption, if Australia stays exactly where they are and the US cuts, that is going to weaken the US dollar a little bit. So we might see a small come down in the exchange rate. What constitutes a retirement account? I have equities and fixed income. Well, Nancy, good to see you as always. I've known Nancy now for, gosh, what, 15 years, Nancy, since we first saw each other in a Silicon Valley networking event in Palo Alto back in 2010. So what constitutes a retirement account? It has to be saved for retirement. So to mention equities and fixed income, these are the asset classes within an account. And indeed, you may have a taxable brokerage account, which in your mind is for retirement. But if it is not some sort of qualified retirement account, i.e. the ones we've previously mentioned, if it's not one of those types, then it's really not going to be considered a retirement account. That would be a mighty stretch. I've never heard of that. I've never contemplated it. And I don't think it's likely the argument would succeed if someone came along and said, well, I've been saving into this taxable brokerage account for retirement. That's been my honest to goodness intention. Give me tax treaty treatment for this account. That's a bit of a stretch. Christian asks, sorry, going back to the previous slide, what about an ESOP? No, I don't. That's a great question, Christian. And that's probably the closest one I can find to being truly on the fence. An employee stock ownership program, which is not to be confused with the option program, an ownership program. Andrew, oh, be careful about Andrew. I don't want to reveal anything confidential there, but that what Andrew's saying might well be the way to do it, is to roll it into an IRA. But as for the ESOP itself, if you wanted to move that back in, okay, there's a chat going. Okay, you guys have at it. That would be the way around it, is the rollover back into the IRA. Okay, let's move on. So the bullet points have just loaded here. So how to convert your money in the most cost-effective manner. This is what I alluded to earlier to do with the interbank spread. This is the business model of foreign exchange, and just it's such a shame how few people understand this. They're lured by the marketing budget of Wise and think that Wise are truly doing this for free when in fact they're not. I actually have a bone to pick with how Wise advertise. I think it is deceptive advertising because what they do is they present the interbank rate and then they say, this is the rate you're getting. Oh, and then we're adding our fee on top of that. Well, how's their fee determined? It's a percentage of the interbank rate. It's no different. It would be as if Commonwealth Bank coming along and saying, our mortgage interest rate is exactly what the Reserve Bank of Australia's bank rate is, which whatever that is right now, I think 3.25%. Our interest rate is 3.25%. Oh, but we add 1.5% because that's our fee, but our interest rate is 3.25. It's like, no, that's just false. Your interest rate is actually closer to 5%, or in this case of the foreign exchange providers, it's a spread of approximately 50 to 60 basis points in the case of Wise. Schwab will do 50, which I still don't think is that competitive. We've negotiated a rate with Currencies Direct at 0.25, which is the lowest, approximately half of what you're going to see out there in the retail land. Interactive brokers will go lower than that, but Interactive Brokers is an interesting provider. It's certainly very, very cost effective. But the problem with them is that they don't want to be used for foreign exchange. They want to be used as an investment brokerage platform for long-term investments with occasional incidents of foreign exchange tolerated. But if that's all you're doing, then you're going to have your account quickly closed. Okay, so residency definitions determine what options you have available. So at the time of your planned distribution of your US retirement account, will you be a US tax resident or not? And I use this term very purposefully. US tax resident. Why? Because a US tax resident can be any number of legal resident status, a citizen, a permanent resident, a temporary visa holder who satisfies the substantial presence test. We'll get to these in just a moment. So the US tax resident has to distribute their account according to US tax law, which is pretty straightforward. We probably all know this already. After age 59 and a half, you can distribute it and it's taxed as ordinary income to you by the IRS according to US progressive income tax brackets. A non-US tax resident may refer to the income tax treaty for how that distribution should take place. And of course, we'll talk about that. So a US tax resident would be, as I just mentioned, one of these three individuals. It would be a US citizen or dual citizen, a US legal permanent resident who has not yet submitted their I-407. Now, that's very important. Some people, it happens every webinar without fail. Someone will have a green card. They've said, hey, I've been out of the country for a couple of years. It's lapsed. It's not valid anymore. I'm done. Wrong. No, you're not done. Because your legal residence, your ability to enter and exit the US is different from your tax residency. And if you have not submitted this Form I-407, then the IRS still has a bullseye on your back. And so you need to submit that. And I would encourage you speak with a tax professional because there could be some landmines and bear traps, and you don't want to lose a limb when relinquishing that status. So that's a very fraught and involved process, but you need to make sure that you get your I-407 in. You may be considered a long-term US resident. That would subject you to the exit tax, which in turn could subject your kids to an inheritance tax that also applies as part of the Hard Act. But that's a topic for another day. I did that back in January, by the way, an update on the exit tax. And it also keep in mind, it doesn't matter where you are in the world. You could be in Antarctica, Zimbabwe, anywhere in between. Doesn't matter. You are a US tax resident if you meet any one of these three tests. I didn't mention the third one. So the third one would really apply to a temporary visa holder, your E3s, your L1s, your O1s, your H1B visa holders that are in the US. And if they have been in the US for 183 days of the current year, or there's a formula where we add up, and there's a weighting as well. The last 2 years of days as well, then you could be in the US for as few as 122 days and still be covered by the substantial presence test. Now, this is where I draw the line between the work that we do as a wealth advisor and what a CPA does. So quite frequently, clients will say to me, well, what if I move, on late May or something like that? Does my tax residency? Oh, it's like, whoa, whoa, whoa. That's not the business we're in. We do not file tax returns. We're able to give general advice on these kinds of matters, but to get super specific, that's when you're talking to your tax attorney or international CPA on this kind of thing. But in that example, if someone was returning, then yes, they would have a mixed status. They would be a US tax resident for part of the year, and then a non-US tax resident for the other part of the year. The times when I have felt confident about saying, yes, you could do some sort of account distribution were when I-407s or citizenship relinquishments had taken place, and we had in hand the certificate of loss of nationality. That's like the most authoritative documentation showing that someone is not in the US system any longer. And only in those cases have I felt confident to say, yes, let's go ahead in the current tax year and do some sort of distribution. Anonymous Zoom user writes in and says, I know this might be going off the rails, but if I decide to move back to Australia, can I keep my... You absolutely can. Yes, sir or madam, you may keep it, but stay tuned because we're going to be talking about the pros and cons of that right now. Tax investment considerations as a US tax resident abroad, i.e. the person who just wrote in. Well, you can remain a US tax resident or citizen, a permanent resident holder, or temporary, what was it, the substantial presence test. You can remain a US tax resident, but what do you need to do? You've got to continue to file your US tax returns. That's your 1040 every year without fail. Included in that would be your FBARs and your FATCA forms, if applicable to you. Foreign FBARs, very, very likely, because there's a $10,000 US equivalent at any point throughout the year required for that form. FATCA depends on your tax filing status and a host of other asset classes and whatever, but these are simple forms. They're reporting forms. There's no FBAR tax. There's no FATCA tax. They're reporting forms, but boy, if you fail to submit them, the IRS is going to come after you with a stick. We're talking about $10,000 minimum penalties for failing for knowingly, willingly is the term they use, failure to file of those forms. PFIC rules, passive foreign investment company rules. I've got a white paper up on our website, talks about this. It's essentially a punitive tax regime that applies to US tax residents abroad who invest in foreign managed investments, namely like a mutual fund or an ETF, a partnership even, any kind of managed investment program, and the US is not going to treat that very nicely. There's the exit tax. That's a very popular topic, that one. There's taxation of foreign retirement accounts. I know this sounds like it's tangential well, it is tangential to talk about superannuation, but today we're not talking about that. That's a different yet related topic. So suddenly the IRS is going to want to tax your superannuation account either during your accumulation years or at distribution. There's a less common situation with income tax asymmetry due to foreign exchange translation gains on foreign investments, most commonly foreign investment property. And then, of course, there's the US estate tax considerations for US situs assets, which I covered just last month in last month's webinar. What happens to visa holder, legal permanent resident or US citizen once renounced? Well, after leaving the US and thus not meeting any of the tests, then you're not subject to the citizenship-based taxation system that the US has. Okay, FATCA. What is FATCA? Great question. That is a topic to go look up. It's a foreign. It's embarrassing, but I can't recall the acronym. It's Foreign Account Transaction Compliance Act, or foreign. It's essentially it's another one of these these laws that came about following 2008. There was a Swiss banker who worked with UBS who was knowingly selling Swiss bank accounts as being a US tax avoidance program, scheme, whatever you want to call it. And then they came out following the GFC. Maybe the timing was just a coincidence because there was the appetite for regulatory reform, hence the Dodd-Frank Act. And they came out with FATCA around that time. FBARs, however, has been on the books since the 1970s. It just wasn't really enforced until the 2000s. And the energy to enforce that actually came about from 2001. So it's to do with tracking who's giving money to what foreign terrorist organization, for instance. Okay, foreign account tax. Thank you, Andrew. I think that's what I said. I might have said something slightly different, but very, very close. Okay. I should not. Okay, correct. The conclusion that you've drawn there is correct, Christian. You should not invest in Australian ETFs, given that they are definitely PFICs. That is correct. So what can you do? Well, it's been a few years, but you should watch my webinar on how to invest in a PFIC compliant manner. And the answer is essentially individual Australian stocks. So I'm not endorsing these stocks, but just as examples of Australian stocks, your Commonwealth Banks, Telstra, Wesfarmers, QBE, whatever, you're owning the individual stocks. That's not a passive foreign investment company. There are US issued ETFs that invest in Australia. So they're Australian index funds so you're holding, I think it's a 50 stock index portfolio through the US. So it's not considered a PFIC. And that's about it in terms of what you could do on the equity side to avoid being in a PFIC. All right, next, moving right along. So options for US account distributions. Well, your options are going to vary depending on what your situation is. So if you're a US citizen, permanent resident, or green card holder, of course, the US citizens, you're always subject to US tax. The permanent resident, you're same thing, always subject to US tax until your Form I-407 is filed. And the temporary visa holder is subject to US taxes only while a US tax resident. And when, as a temporary visa holder, considered a US tax resident, when they meet which test? The substantial presence test, correct. That's right. Okay, so Michael Meadows writes in and says, regarding PFICs, can I just keep investing in US? That's it. Yes, that's the answer. You could say that this is a protectionist measure that the US has to keep people investing in the US, and viewed through one lens, that would be correct. It didn't come about necessarily through that. It came about through a difference in taxation of mutual fund capital gains and income that European funds had at the time, which offered them an advantage. And so given that the US can't change the rules in Europe, they said, we're basically just going to tax you really, really heavily if you invest in these foreign funds. Okay, options for temporary or former US tax residents. Here's what we have here. The US tax treaty, further detail on private letter rulings, and what to do about over withholding, which sadly has become a common problem. So Australia has a double income tax treaty with the US, and Article 18.1 is the relevant topic for us today. But broadly speaking, what does an income tax treaty do? It mitigates tax evasion and avoidance, which apparently Mr. Anthony Castro did not read when he provided the advice that he did to others, and that's why he's serving his time in a federal penitentiary right now. Some people on today's call will know what I'm talking about with that. It's provide dispute resolution mechanisms, encourage investment, promote information sharing and cooperation, establish rules for residency and tiebreakers. That's a fascinating topic, by the way, residency tiebreaker situations. And support, lastly, hence what has the orange rectangle around it, support pension portability and Social Security coordination. I personally don't like that word pension, because in the UK they use it, it has a slightly different definition. And pension in American parlance means essentially an income stream paid to you by way of prior employment. That's a pension. So you get paid money for every year that you live or for a defined period of time. That's a pension. Whereas a 401k is not a pension. It is a retirement account. It's a defined contribution account. You get this money. It's yours. We've given you a match, maybe, probably. We've given you a match, and it's yours to go do with it what you want. However, in the language of the tax treaty, a pension is this one and the same thing. Now, that gets tricky because this was written in the early 1980s when superannuation had not even come into effect, and other types of situations simply weren't contemplated when the language was written. Namely, what about a lump sum distribution? Can a lump sum distribution be considered a pension? And in fact, it can, according to a private letter ruling. Now, note what I said. This is not personal advice. Do not act based on what I'm telling you today. I'm saying in one isolated instance that was published for one taxpayer's circumstances, that's what was held. And that's what a private letter ruling is. It is not law. It was a specific ruling for one individual. However, in that private letter ruling, they did say that a rollover, a lump sum distribution could in fact be still deemed a pension. Okay, so the article that interests us when we're on this topic of retirement account portability is Article 18.1. And in here we see written in legalese, in double taxation treaty legalese, pensions, which I just went through, and other similar remuneration, which is, it's good that they included that because that opens up other account types that may yet come into existence and that hadn't at the time this was written, paid to an individual who is a resident of one of the contracting states, namely Australia, in consideration of past performance, shall be taxable only in that state. So let's read that in English. If you're an Australian tax resident only, i.e. not also a dual citizen or still have your green card, who has a US retirement account, you are subject only to Australian taxation on this account. Which begs the next question then. So how does Australia tax these retirement accounts? What a wonderful segue to the next topic here. So what we know is that the ATO has a very strict definition of what a foreign superannuation fund is, and none of the US retirement accounts meet that definition. So when you have an IRA, a 401k, a 401a, a 401k, 403b, a Roth IRA, blah, 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 et cetera, we know you don't have a foreign superannuation account, so it cannot simply roll right back into your superannuation fund. So how does the ATO treat this? It treats it very simply as a foreign trust, and the tax treatment of a foreign trust, thankfully, it's actually relatively straightforward. I won't say it's always advantageous because it's not. It's going to depend on how long you've had this US retirement account. But the corpus, the basis, taxable basis, is the technical term of the trust, is the contributions made by the individual and their employer. So that's very simple for me to say. And for some folks, I've got one client in particular where he's a physician, worked at a medical practice in the 90s and 2000s, which was then consolidated. They changed retirement plans under the new consolidated entity. Then he moved elsewhere, and then they changed retirement plans. It is, long story short, it is practically impossible for him to find hard and fast evidence proving what his contribution and his employer's contribution was. And so that is an engagement that he's taken up with a CPA because that is not our territory to help figure out exactly what the basis is. By the way, I should have mentioned if you do have a question, actually, you know what? I was about to say something that's not true. So my Zoom updated, and now I can suddenly see Q&As without having to exit. Peter Branscombe, thank you for joining us here today. Is growth in a 401k still tax-free from the time you move back to Australia to begin distributions at 59 of age? No, it is not. And you use the word still tax-free. No, the growth is not tax-free and never was tax-free when you moved back to Australia. So short answer there, no. There's a chat that's popped up, or a few chats. Christian again, oh, Daniel Flint. So growth in the IRA is tax-free, but then all distributions are taxed. So it's taxed then, I guess. So growth is tax-free when you're in the US. and very likely probably also when you're in Australia until distributions occur. Then when you distribute, that's when we need to figure out what percentage of your account was your and your employer's contributions, what percent is growth. What is growth is what we're coming to on the next slide here, which answers a few questions. What happens if the majority is inherited money, Nancy? What did I mention earlier? Who is this presentation for, and who is it not for? What does it not deal with? It does not deal with inherited IRAs. And if you've got inherited IRA, it is not money that you put aside for your retirement. It was someone else's retirement. So keeping records of contribution is very important. Yes, correct, Daniel, that's exactly right. Okay, I'm going to carry on here. So thus the growth is what's taxed by the ATO. And I see this in varying amounts depending on typically the age of the client, when the work they did in the US was done, and thus when that account balance came into existence, because the older it is, the more likely the majority of that account is growth, and thus it's going to have a less attractive tax treatment in Australia. It's possible it could end up being worse than US domestic tax treatment because of the difference in the federal rates between the US and Australia. But that's rare. I have a client who's in New South Wales who worked at a medical facility in the early 1980s and left. I think he left in 84 or something like that. So he's had this account for 40 years. And so the employer and employee contribution is minuscule compared to the total account balance. And so most of it is ordinary income taxable in Australia. Not a lot that can really be done to soften that blow, unfortunately. Most clients, I'd say, in the past 10 years that come back, the growth percentage is a lot lower. It has increased, however. We've been blessed with strong market returns really since 2023. So it's going to vary. What can you do to offset that? We're coming to that in a little bit. Let me see. Is there a new Q&A? No, there isn't. So let me move on here. US custodian tax withholding. So bad news here is whoever your brokerage firm is, I'm using the term custodian because that's another function that these firms serve, is holding custody of the asset. They're likely going to hit you with a 30% withholding rate on the distribution of the account, even if you follow all of the steps. You complete your W-8 BEN, you submit it to them, you say, hey guys, we've got a tax treaty. It's very clear in saying that there's a 0% withholding rate. That I'm not trying to pull a fast one here. This is, it's not a controversial or edge case argument that I'm making here. In fact, I'm about to show you on the next slide. This is taken from, if you see the source down the bottom there, the IRS itself, tax treaty table. And I've highlighted here pensions. So this is intended to be a key reference sheet for IRS agents to determine what is the appropriate withholding on pensions and annuities from different countries according to their tax treaty. And you see on the very first row, pensions and annuities, there's the appropriate article reference, and the withholding rate is 0%. So even with that, Schwab and others will say, we don't care. We have no interest in being some sort of judge or referee on whether 30% is appropriate or not. We're going to withhold that, and you take up your argument with the IRS come April 15th the following year. Why do they do that? The answer is very simple, and we'll all breathe a frustrated sigh because it makes sense, and that is Schwab have exactly nothing to gain in this situation. If they are held to be wrong and they didn't withhold and a penalty could hit them, they have exactly nothing to gain. So they say, we don't care if it says 0%. We don't care if it says negative 100%. We are going to withhold the mandatory withholding rate, which is 30%. And so they do. They withhold 30%. Not all custodians will do that. There is one that I know of that won't, but that's more of a trade secret and something that we have had a couple clients go through. We're not doing it too much anymore just because the hassle is too great. But under the tax treaty, you may be exempted from withholding tax entirely if it's considered to be a pension. That's the 0%. Article 18, paragraph 4 makes a reference to periodic payments. I mentioned that earlier. A lump sum distribution may also be considered a periodic payment. Someone's written into the chat. So Jeffrey Y asks about what about dividends in the 401k? Fair question, Jeff. If it's considered growth or dividends, it's essentially anything, any form of return that was not your or your employer's contribution, like any incremental change in the account value over and above your employer's contribution, is going to be taxed as ordinary income in Australia because it's deemed to be a foreign trust. Andrew writes, does the same treatment apply if you withdraw your entire 401k and move it to Australia? Andrew, you might, you do well, maybe. The recording for this is going to be up in a day. You'll want to watch this again because your question presupposes something we've already answered. If you withdrew it entirely while you're in the US, then you're withdrawing it as a US tax resident. If you're under age 59 and a half, you're getting hit with a 10% penalty tax, and the entire account balance will be taxed at ordinary income rates. Lynn, sorry, I have to leave and head off to the airport. Well, good for you. Have a safe trip. Okay, let's keep going here. So despite, and this is what I was just saying a moment ago, despite having a properly completed WA Ben on file, many custodians may still withhold, and because they don't care, because they just have nothing to gain from it. When this occurs, the default method for obtaining is to fill out your 1040 NR. What is the NR? This sounds new and different, right? We're all used to the form 1040, but the form 1040 NR is for the non-resident. So that is, you were a former US tax resident, you're no longer a US tax resident. I'm going to fill out a 1040 NR. There's a few more steps. Sorry, did I skip a page? No, I didn't. There's a few more steps to it. You need to attach copies of your 1042S statements, calculate the appropriate treatment, make your argument there on your 1040. Sorry, it's actually on the WABEN. It's just a little bit lower there. And then submit that to the IRS. Hope and pray and do everything you possibly can. Cross your fingers and toes, and then at some unknown, ill-defined period of time, very likely they will refund you. But it's not guaranteed, and that's very nerve-wracking. Very, very nerve-wracking if significant sums of money are going to be held by the IRS, and it's really at their ransom and discretion if they are going to submit that back to you or not. But they probably will, because their own tax treaties, their own key reference data sheets suggest that that is the appropriate withholding rate. What could you do alternatively? This is interesting. You could claim a credit for US taxes paid on your Australian tax return. That may make sense. In fact, if your IRA or 401k is from decades ago and most of its growth anyway, you know what? You're going to be paying a lot of tax, so it really wouldn't matter that much if you paid US tax first, then got a foreign tax credit for tax paid, because you're going to owe the ATO anyway. Okay, so that's really what we have here for you. If you are a former US tax resident, i.e. Australian only tax resident. What to do if you are a US tax resident? Well, the options are short and sweet, and that is, you have to wait till you're age 59 and a half or older, and you can distribute that account penalty free. If you take it before age 59 and a half, you must pay a 10% ordinary income penalty on that. You may be able to get what's called a substantially equal periodic distribution discount, which means you're going to take it in roughly equal installments for a minimum of 5 years, and you could avoid the 10% penalty. Very rarely done in practice, because people end up just waiting or taking a different treatment. Excuse me, there's also hardship withdrawals, not for anything you'd actually want to have happen. Of course, loans may be available that could help with a house down payment, but it needs to be paid back within 5 years. There's a little bit of interest, but it's payable to you. So that's the kind of banking relationship I like, is when your interest is paid back to you. IRAs, similar deal there, hardship withdrawals, and now higher education costs. So what can you do? Well, as I mentioned, you can distribute according to regular US tax rules, or you can take it before age 59 and a half. So the options are really simple. Wait till you're 59 and a half or older, or don't wait and pay 10% extra penalty tax, or I guess option 2A is do the substantially equal periodic payment, which is 5-year equal installments, and you'll avoid the 10% penalty. Okay, so distribution considerations and tax. Let's talk about this. Many individuals, not everyone, but many desire to simply be done with the US, and they want to, just cut all their ties, move their money over and call it a day. Well, not so fast, because you could be leaving the IRS a big tip, and you don't need to tip the IRS. No, you do not. So the way I present this, it's a little bit like the way the lottery in the US works. You can either get paid out a big fat lump sum and have a huge percentage of tax taken, or if you're a little bit more patient and you take it over an installment, some period of time, you will lower the total amount of tax paid. And I put this together just now because I think it perfectly makes the point. So in scenario A, we've got a client who has $1 million in their US retirement account, their IRA in this case. They say, you know what, I'm done with the US. I'm not interested in keeping anything there anymore. It's just adding complexity and headaches and whatever. I'm going to distribute the whole thing. Great. Well, you can do that. You get by the way, the standard tax filing treatment, tax filing status, I should say, when one is not also married to a US tax resident, i.e., you've got one US citizen married to a non-citizen, is married filing separate, which is not a great tax filing status at all. It has the single brackets with a break on capital gains that comes away earlier, so that's not very nice at all. So your taxable income ends up being $985. Your effective tax rate, that means the average rate of tax paid, is $322,784, according to the tax calculator that I pulled shortly before this presentation. And that was from Smart Asset, that was from Smart Asset. Okay, so 322 compared with if you had the same $1 million balance, and of course, it's not an apples to apples comparison, because if someone did have $1 million balance and they were only withdrawing $100,000 a year, remember there's investment growth on that. So that what's remaining, the $900,000 remaining, is still going to continue to earn interest. But in this hypothetical scenario, to keep it very simple and to make the point, if you took out $100,000 a year for 10 years, you have the same standard deduction. You've got taxable income of $85,000 and your effective rate is 13.84, less than a half, closer to a third the effective rate of taking the $1 million lump sum. So your total annual tax is 13,841 times 10, 138,410. Again, massively less than the lump sum tax. And so this is why I'd say almost without exception, I very, very rarely see that someone says, Ashley, now that you've explained that and I understand it, I don't care. I want it out and I want it out now. And I'm going to tip the IRS about $200,000 because I want it out now. So most people end up just leaving it and investing and then taking the annual distribution, being mindful of their tax rate. Okay, so now that you've left the US, you've got these US retirement funds you want to distribute. What do you actually do with those funds? Well, let's be clear, you are not obligated to contribute them back to your superannuation account. Many people start with that default assumption. They say, well, this was a retirement account. I guess it's got to go back into a retirement account. No, it doesn't. You could do anything you want with it. You could gift it to the kids. You could go to Las Vegas. You could do whatever you want with it. However, probably the smartest thing would be to put it back into a retirement account unless you had other significant retirement savings and you knew you were in good stead for your retirement, which we don't see prospective clients that have that degree of confidence all that often, in part because it's not easy to determine that, and also there probably wouldn't be prospective clients if they really knew all their numbers and facts and tax impacts in the first place. That's just stating it plainly. Peter's written in, was the previous calculation for a person who is over age 15 and a half, or the age of the person doesn't change the calculation? The age of the person doesn't, well, I get it. Short answer, Peter, there. Let's go back here. This one, this is assuming over 15 and a half. And the reason why is because there's no penalty tax applied. So we could slap another 10% on that. So if you're under age 15 and a half, then that would be 42.28%. So really an extraordinarily high rate of tax to pay. Okay, so the point I was making here is that you're not obligated to contribute it back into superannuation, although it's probably the best thing for you to do. Jenny Kelly writes in, but won't the IRS come after the Australian superannuation accounts once it deems that you have put in more than your employer? Jenny, I suffer from one of these primitive male brains that has difficulty talking and thinking at the same time, and I'm going to have to read what you've said again. But won't the IRS come after the Australian superannuation accounts once it deems that you've put in more than your employer? Not if you're a US tax resident. Sorry, if you are a former US tax resident. If you're an Australian only tax resident, you have you're compliant with all state and federal tax obligations, and you have effectively, note effectively, underlined, effectively relinquished your US citizenship or submitted your I-407, and you are not in the US tax system, the US has no domain over your superannuation account. You're a joint citizen, okay, dual citizen, then everything I've said about dual citizens applies, and you need to look at those slides very carefully that apply to US tax residents, because anything I've said that applies to Australian tax residents only does not apply to you if you're a dual citizen. And also, as I mentioned at the outset, this I can't give personal advice here either. I'm just pointing you back to earlier slides that said, if you're a US tax resident, then you are subject to US tax rules, no matter where you are. So just to explore that for a second, however, it gets complicated. It gets complicated for US tax residents because Jenny's right with her question here. You don't actually, if you're a US tax resident, you don't really want to be contributing to super, because you could flip the treatment of that super account and go from being an employee benefit trust to being what's called a foreign grantor trust treatment, where suddenly you have to recognize the tax the gain on your super account every year going forward, and that could be detrimental to your tax planning if that's what you want to do. So for US citizens, it does get more complicated. You don't necessarily want to contribute to a super account. Maybe you do, maybe you don't. If your spouse is not a US tax resident, that's when spousal contributions begin to make a lot of sense. Helen writes in, if someone fills out an I-407 to relinquish green card permanent residency, can they still receive? Yes, they can. Helen, go back to, was it February? I did a Social Security update. Interestingly, and it boggles the mind, but one's legal residence has nothing to do with legal residency status, has nothing to do with their Social Security entitlement. So even if you relinquish your citizenship, your Social Security status under current law is unaffected by that. Might there be a change in law? Of course, anything's possible. There hasn't been anything mentioned, but clients have written in being concerned that with the funding pressure on the Social Security Trust Fund, which is due to run out of money in 2032, remember they've got enough to pay 3/4 of benefits from current payroll taxes. So Social Security is not going away. There's just a ticking time bomb that by 2032 benefits may be reduced by 25% if something isn't done. As we've seen previously with looking at FATCA just earlier in today's conversation, we know that legislation seems to happen when there's no other choice in the US. And so there's probably going to be something that will happen around 2031, I'm thinking, because there's many millions of Social Security beneficiaries are going to be very upset if their benefits get cut by 25%. So something's going to happen. Does it necessarily mean that foreign beneficiaries are going to get cut off? No, there's a host of things that could happen that's outside of the scope of today's presentation. Okay, so what could you do? If you've moved your funds back to Australia and you're not a US tax resident, because that changes everything, you might consider making a 3-year using the 3-year bring forward rule or the 5-year retroactive carry forward of concessional contributions. 2 more chats have come in. Daniel, do they withhold 30%? No, they don't. They withhold 28.5% for non-residents. Scott, how would monthly distributions from a defined benefit pension be taxed in Australia for an Australian resident? I think, Scott, the good question that I mentioned earlier, I think, and my mistake, I should have included DB plans would definitely be included as qualified pensions under the tax treaty. So it would be taxable only in Australia. And you know what? It would probably have very good tax treatment because how would they calculate what percentage is growth versus employer versus employee contribution? So a foreign pension could be a very nice a US pension could be a very nice thing to have in Australia for non-US tax residents. Okay, so mention here about these 2 contribution strategies. That's a way you might offset by making super contributions. You might offset the taxable growth component of that distribution. And so that brings us to the conclusion of today's presentation, almost perfectly on time, leaving a few minutes for questions here. Next month, I'm going to be talking about the flip side of what I spoke about last month. Last month, I spoke about how does a US or how might a US estate be structured optimally for Australian beneficiaries. This time, we're going to be talking about how might an Australian estate be structured and how does tax work on an Australian estate at the estate holder's passing. So what tax might you expect if you're in the US if you're inheriting Australian assets is what I'm trying to say. All right, so thank you for joining me all the way through here. Questions and hopefully some answers. Thank you, Nancy. Appreciate that. Gerald, fancy seeing you here. If you have a Roth US, then what is the best path? Well, it's included under the retirement accounts addressed today, but to get into specifics, which of course we're not here to do, but I would say that the thing with Roths is part of the glisten, the attractiveness of a Roth comes unstuck when you move back to Australia because it loses that tax advantage status that it had when it was in the US. And that is the whole point of having a Roth is that you've contributed pre-tax dollars to it. It's now growing tax-free. It's going to be distributed tax-free as well. Not so fast because the ATO looks at that and says, hey, this is just like any other foreign trust that we tax. And so the earnings will be taxable by the ATO. So it might be too clever by half having significant Roth balances. What can you do beforehand? Well, that's something that we would be advising clients on. Karen writes, how would distributions from an Australian DB pension be taxed in Australia and the US for a dual citizen? Karen, that's outside the scope of today's presentation. We're not talking about Australian defined benefits. We would be talking about a US defined benefit account. So a little bit of a different situation. And that's very, very specific. That's to say, you have an Australian pension, you're a dual citizen. What's the US tax going to be on that? It's probably going to be assessable. That's I feel pretty confident that because remember the US has the savings clause. The savings clause captures basically any income source, any income type whatsoever, no matter where it's paid, and seeing as you remain a US tax resident, then it's going to be assessable. Thank you, Dallas. Thank you, Daniel. Thank you, Christine. Greg writes, is a Roth IRA corpus the same as cost basis? Yes. Whatever your contributions were. Actually, I just wrote an email back to a client on this yesterday, and it was the amount that he's going to be able to take out tax-free is going to be whatever the annual contribution limit was. It could not possibly be more than $1 than that because you couldn't have contributed more than that because those were the contribution limits. Cam writes, with the exception, there's one obscure exception, and that would be with a mega backdoor Roth IRA, but I'll leave that one hanging because that's an obscure one. Okay, Cam writes, after living in the US, can non-US tax residents have difficulty in transferring funds back to Australia if their US bank accounts are closed? Yes. Yep, you certainly can. That's kind of where we come into it, is planning ahead of time. We would say you do not want to close those US bank accounts because it can be a nightmare to get them reopened if you need to, and this is a perfect scenario where you would need to. Thank you. It's a great start to think about. You're welcome, Mary Elizabeth, and good to see you. Zoom user, I was informed to sell all my assets before leaving the US and going back to Australia. I think this would include 401 too, as well as our properties. Okay, then Zoom user, you should speak to a qualified cross-border financial advisor. Hiran, how about S blocks and margin loans? Certainly outside the scope of today. That's not a retirement account. A security-backed line of credit is what Hiran is referring to there, and margin loans. I'm not even sure what the question is on that, because that's something that cannot be established on a retirement account at all. It's only on a taxable brokerage account. So not sure what the question is, but even then it would be outside the scope of retirement accounts. Zoom user, yes, thanks. Christy, hey, Christy, good to see you. We were just talking about you this morning. We hope to speak with you in the not too distant future. There'll be an invitation. Greg, thank you. You're welcome. Robert, good to see you as well. And we also saw you this morning as well. So thank you everyone for joining me. I hope this was informative. Oh, someone wrote in the Q&A panel, so I'm just going to jump back there. Thomas White, good to see you again. Thomas, hope life is good on the Gold Coast. All right. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a wonderful day, and hopefully see you next month. Bye-bye.